Okay. Okay. And as I said before, the recording will be available on our Vimeo channel in a day or so. And there we go. Okay, so I would love, and I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Brent Ortego. He's a retired biologist with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and he spent 34 years working on non-game and endangered species issues in Texas. He began banding birds under a permit from Dr. Ross Dawkins from San Angelo in 1995. And one of his projects was banding hummingbirds at his home in Victoria County from 1995 to 2010. During the first winter, he banded 14 hummingbirds. But by 2010, he had banded in a year in a peak wintering population of 160 birds. And I don't know about you, but I always thought all the hummingbirds pretty much left, but this proves otherwise. And so during his presentation, Dr. Ortego is going to discuss these amazing birds and how that remarkable increase of Victoria winter hummingbirds occurred. And I will tell from personal experience, I had the pleasure of Tom and I helping band hummingbirds with Dr. Ortego out in Comfort. And it is like no other bird banding ever. And if you can appreciate how small these birds are and how much you can do. I actually banded one hummingbird and I was so stressed out, that little tiny leg, that little tiny band, but he trusted me to let me do that, and I'm forever grateful. So I'm going to turn this over now to Dr. Ortego and let him tell you the story of his experience. Brent?
Thank you, Patsy. It's a wonderful introduction. And also would like to thank Becca for inviting me to give you a program. Like you mentioned, Ross Dawkins was the holder of the banding permit, and I was assisting him. Back in 95, there was not a lot known about hummingbirds as far as their survivorship, their movements. So the bird banding lab started promoting banders to expand what they worked on and take in hummingbirds. It was quite a challenge because they didn't know how to do it, and we didn't either, and we had to work through the process to be able to catch the birds, safely handle them, and band them. So this story is going to be about my first winter banding hummers at my home, where I only caught 14. Through time, subsequent winters, that number that we caught each winter was got up to 160. That was about 2006. After 2006, we had reached the peak, and we started seeing oscillations in the numbers during the winter. So I only went with this story as far as the 160. I didn't want to talk about after. Okay, here we go. This project, aside from Ross Dawkins, I had lots of assistance. The initial banding I could do by myself because we were only using traps, or what's called as a mist net tent, where we caught the hummingbirds usually one at a time, and it was a fairly slow process. But as we started attracting more birds and we wanted to try and ban all that was present, we went to other methodologies, and in this case, we used mist nets. And that worked fairly well. But the mist netting process, you not only caught hummingbirds, you caught songbirds. So it took several assistants to be able to conduct the banding. And I really want to thank some of my assistants like Brian Rorex from Rockport, Samita Prasad from Houston, Craig Zalk from Houston, Charlie Brower from West Columbia, Sue Heat from Lake Jackson, and Glenn Schwartz from Corpus. And there are many more that helped us, but these were the main assistants. So why work with hummingbirds? One, we don't know much about them. They are brightly colored. They're numerous. They're in close proximity to people. So we have our curiosities. So we started our research. Our main research tool was to use bands. And let me show you right in front of you. This is a hummingbird band, partially open. It's slightly bigger than the ear of a dime. So it's pretty small. Uh, when we started working with hummingbirds, the bird banding lab normally makes the bands for the banders, and all you have to do is use a pliers and crimp them on. So this hummingbird over here is inside of a mallard band. So I used the partially open mallard band, partly as a demo, but also to help me control the bird. You just slide the bird in the band. It cannot open its wings. You put it on a scale. In this case, this bird weighed 3.9 grams. Normal body weight for a male is about 3.2 grams. So this individual had fattened up for migration, and it was captured at my house. They can get up to as much as 5 grams. If that was a 5 gram ruby throat, it wouldn't fit in this leg hole, this leg band. But anyway, in the banding, we had to create our own bands. So the bird banding lab printed a sheet of these rows of these numbers. These numbers is the code we use to log in to their website to identify the bird, to identify the location, the bander, the date, time, all of that information gets logged in, sort of like a social security number. The E represents actually 4 numbers. Then you have these 5 other numbers that go along with the band, and hey, social security numbers have 9 numbers. So each band had the same. So the first project we looked at, there was a lot of discussion about ruby throats migrating across the Gulf. So what evidence did we have that they migrated across the Gulf? We occasionally had reports from oil rigs, from people in boats, and sometimes foreign countries where ruby throats made landfall. They said, oh, if you're on the Yucatan and a ruby throat showed up, well, pretty good chance it went across the Gulf. But, we're dealing with maybe 7 million birds. So odds are not everybody goes the same way. So here's a little snippet of some of the data we produced. The banding sites are the bigger dots, and they're color coded. So yours black, which is in Corpus Christi. Red is near my house in Victoria. Blue is in Lake Jackson. Green is Houston. The corresponding other colors scattered across is where the bird was recaptured. So you have these 3, 4 sites, and look at the foreign recaptures of their bird and where they were. We had Connecticut, Minnesota, and I'll apologize to Canada. I don't know the province, but anyway, up in Canada. I had a high concentration right over here near St. Louis, and we had scattered birds across. So if the birds were flying due north-south in migration, odds are they wouldn't end up in Victoria or any of these coastal Texas sites, because due south is the Gulf of Mexico. So birds were adjusting to the terrain and what was survivable, for them to get to their wintering grounds or to get back to their breeding grounds. So they came through either in the fall or the spring at some point in coastal Texas, and they were caught. Now, here's a little bit of data. I throw these little snippets in quite a few of my slides. One of the issues with a ruby throat, as far as learning a lot with bands, the bander over here in Illinois, she got lots of returns. Birds she banded and she'd recapture in following years. I got very few. And I'll give you a little bit of data later on showing how few the birds were recaptured at my location, primarily because they were passing through. They didn't come to Victoria, Texas and spend the entire winter, the ruby throats. Most of them were just passing through in the fall or spring. They may have been there from a few minutes to maybe a few days. But why would that bird remember that site if it only spent a few days? There's a broad landscape, for it to migrate through. Whether it's going to come back to that exact place and get caught again during the days I happen to be trying to trap gives it a very low probability. So over the years, I'll show you data that we only recaptured ruby throats less than 0.1% 1 year following the initial banding. Now we caught birds within a few days, but trying to recapture a bird the following year was pretty challenging. Like I said, less than 0.1%. But what I did learn in recapturing, we were trying to band 3 times a week. When you work in at least 5 days a week, and sometimes Parks and Wildlife requires you to work 7 days a week, trying to squeeze in 3 days of banding can be challenging. But over the years, what I learned was the males could be recaptured up about at 11% rate for 3 days after the original banding. About 11% of the males I recaptured. Females, this was in the spring, females about 7% we would recapture. In the fall, where you have more ruby throats, again, it's about 12% for the males we'd recapture after 3 days and 8% of the females. It's kind of interesting in that it's kind of like the purple martins one of your members was talking about today. With the purple martin, it's highly important for that male to get to the breeding colony site first. That increases his probability he's going to have a suitable site to attract a mate. Same thing with the ruby throats, but they linger longer than the females. What some people hypothesize is that they're not as fit for migration because they're smaller. They're about 25% smaller than the female. So they may have to rest longer than the female to rebuild their fat loads before they take that next step in migration. Might be true. I don't know, but it's something worth thinking about. A third little project we worked on is what I was invited to talk about. Becca was really interested in learning about wintering hummingbirds. And most of the time, before I started banding hummingbirds, we were told they're not going to survive in the winter. And if some of you know Louisiana, excuse me, got to turn these things off. But Louisiana has a famous ornithology group at LSU. Back in before the 90s, there was a standing order. Actually, it was more before the 80s. There was a standing order. If their staff saw a wintering hummingbird, shoot it. It was going to die anyway. That was the belief of the professors running the museum over there. And they said, we didn't want to waste that bird just dying naturally. We'd collect it and put it in our museum. Nancy Newfield was one of the pioneering hummingbird banders in Louisiana and also the Gulf Coast. Proved that they survived the winter and they would come back. So George Lowry and Bob Newman, which were the leading professors there, had to change their opinion. They found evidence these birds can survive, and the same individuals will come back. So they stopped the kill order and enjoyed the birds. But anyway, to survive the winter, you're going to have some form of habitat that's suitable for the bird. Preferably you'll have flowers, but if you don't have flowers, feeders work. And you need some space. It's not a huge amount of space, but you do need some space. and your climate has to be mild enough for the birds to handle the harsh weather. But in the wintertime, it's mostly western hummers. So how harsh can they take it? They're in the Rocky Mountains. Their temperatures may get down to freezing or low 40s every night. So they can handle, winter on the Gulf Coast. I want to show you where the study area is. Those not too familiar with Victoria, this is Clutter Creek Reservoir, which is on the west side of Victoria. The Guadalupe River is over here. San Antonio is about 15 miles to the west. And we have Clutter Creek coming out of the lake, running across Highway 59. So it's right in this vicinity, kind of an Oakmont riparian setting, right off of Highway 59, southwest of Victoria by about 3 miles. This is the location of my banding site. I had access to, in the end, 6 acres. When I started, I just had 2 acres, which is my house site, and it extended to a Resaca down the hill. And then eventually Craig Zalk bought the 2 adjoining lots. He said, "Hey, Brent, why don't we abandon that yard?" I said, "Craig, I don't own it, and I don't know the owner." He said, "I think I can figure that out." So, next week he told me, "I bought it." Oh, that's pretty good. I said, "Okay, then we will abandon the former property." So we did. So when we started, I was catching initially. Let me see if the data is here. I'll show you the data a little later. This is a view of my home. I basically have a brick home with big live oaks in the front. I have flower beds the full length of the house. Actually, it goes around about 2/3 of the house, mostly shrimp plants. At the base of trees, I also have flower beds. Those are mostly Turk's cap, red sage, or coral bean. This is what the front looks like. Very few hummingbirds actually use the front yard in the winter. Backyard, the view outside of the living room shows a old growth mesquite forest leading down to the Resaca at the bottom of the hill. There's a difference in elevation of over 25 feet from the Resaca to my house. And if you're familiar with what temperature does in the wintertime on a calm night, cold air sinks. In a normal winter night, when it's calm and cold, it'll be 6 degrees colder at the bottom of the hill than at my home. And during dry periods, like we get in one of these droughts, it'll actually be 10 degrees colder, kind of like desert situations. So if it's 30 degrees at the top of the property, it's in the winter, it could be 20 degrees at the bottom. So it can get pretty cold, but the birds handle it fine. But this is more of a side view looking at the back of my house. It just shows more flower beds. Then I have scattered flower beds, intermittently wherever it was suitable. And mostly shrimp plant. And the rationale for using shrimp plants fairly heavily, it can survive temperatures down to 28 degrees. So if you're using Turk's cap, well, Turk's cap stop blooming in November. So that doesn't help too much. It's very good for holding a bird in the fall, feeding a bird in the summer, but it's no good for feeding birds in the wintertime. Your red sage can take some of the coldness, but by and large, shrimp plant is the hardiest of the plants I use during the wintertime. Okay, this is the basic numbers. For you normally using bird codes, BUFH, buff-bellied, Rufous hummingbird, black-chin hummingbird, ruby-throated hummingbird, Allen's hummingbird, broadtail, and calliope. So I broke this winter study into 4 periods. we just started off banding and we were happy to catch a few birds. Nobody else had wintering hummingbirds to mount anything. So here we go, we start putting feeders out. Then when we start seeing after October, when all the ruby throats left, we still had some lingering birds. I said, wow, okay. And we make sure we'd have at least one feeder for every bird. Another bird would show up, well, we'd throw another feeder, and we always threw one extra during that period. So we always tried to have one more feeder than we knew we had birds there. So, and at that time, I was permitted to mark the birds with just a little drop of paint. We'd put it on top of the crown of the head. And this allowed us to know we had a stranger coming through the yard. You couldn't read the bands. If you studied them carefully, you might be able to tell it had a band on. But anyway, the first few years, from 95 to 99, using traps and that hummingbird tent, we averaged 14 birds with 12 feeders. And what the 3 represents is birds from previous years. So anything in parentheses is, we had, to say in the case of buff belly during that period, we had captured 2 buff bellies per winter, with an average of 1 being from a previous year. So we didn't have a lot of buff bellies then. And if you were familiar with it, back in the 70s, the buff bellied was restricted to the valley. You didn't have them further north. But in time, they moved up the coast. They went to Corpus Christi. They eventually made it to Victoria. When I was here in 92, the buff bellies did not winter. They left about October or November, and they came back in March. So, by 95, they started actually spending the winter. And what got me real excited with this hummingbird stuff was I always had about the same number of birds throughout the year once I got to about 95. And so, your thought is, hey, they're the same bird. But I found out that first year I was banding, the 6 buff bellies I saw in the yard ended up being 60 different individuals at the end of the year. So while there was never more than 6 at a time, there was a constant flow of birds in and out. Some birds were just passing through like the ruby throat does in migration. Other birds stopped for a reason. They may have stopped in the spring in the staging area to build up resources, and while waiting for their primary food to become available. In latter years, I learned their primary food during the summer was turkey. Typically, even when I had 56 buff bellies during the winters of 2004 to 2006, once May 15th rolled around, the number of buff bellies in my yard changed from about 40 to about 4 or 5. So the blooming of church caps and other food resources allowed the birds to leave this congested area where you're just constantly fighting, give them some more space. Maybe the female needed it to raise young, to not to be hammered every day by competitors. But anyway, we started with traps, and we caught these numbers of birds. Not too many were recaptured, but we were dealing with a very small sample size, 12 per year. What we later learned, birds would be caught in following years roughly at about 20%, 25%. So you have to build up a sizable number before you get any appreciable band returns. We'll talk about the latter years down the road. But you can, over a year, I tell you how many feeders I had. So in 95 to 99, we had 12 feeders on average. In the spring of 99, Craig Zalk bought that property. And I said, well, we got this property. I guess we'll use a few more feeders. So we went from 12 feeders to 25 feeders. That winter with 25 feeders, we caught about 30 hummingbirds. So all we did was change the number of feeders. And also we moved into a different habitat. The where we had the 12 feeders was a residential yard. I showed you pictures of it. Where we put those additional feeders was in undeveloped lot that was mostly shrubs, not any higher than my head. So it was dense brush, relatively low, and we put feeders in there, and the hummingbirds loved it, particularly in the wintertime. And through time, the next year, since we had so much luck with 25 feeders in the winter, we boosted it up to, I think, 40 something feeders, or maybe 50 feeders. But anyway, in that 2-year period, it averaged 40 per year, and the numbers went up again. We ended up in that 2-year period catching 45 hummingbirds in the wintertime. Not in migration, during the winter, 45. I considered winter from 1st of November to 28 February. Then these years, we said, hey, why not? I can do it. We put out 70 feeders for a 3-year period. That's a lot of work, but look at the numbers we were averaging. We're almost 100 hummingbirds a winter by having a little more space, having thick cover, and a lot of feeders. And I spaced my feeders out to give the birds some breeding room. I know in migration with ruby throats or black chins, you can kind of put your feeders really close together and the birds kind of adjust to the proximity of everybody, and they just primarily feed. But in the wintertime, they do lots of fighting. And what we thought we saw over the years was some of these more timid hummers or weaker hummers like ruby throats, black chins, calliope, they really needed cover to escape the beatings. If they stuck their beak out, they were going to get hammered. So they tended to stay to thicker cover. Let's move on. So what did the place look like? It's dense shrubbery. This is a 10-foot, 3/4-inch metal conduit. So that's 10 feet up to this height, and you can see the height of the shrubs and the vines. I had a lot of wildflowers. Yes, I used shrimp plant at the house, but in the adjoining lot, lots of turchcap, red sage, trumpet creeper, honeysuckle, and morning glory, mostly morning glory. I counted the flowers out of curiosity one year. During a wet fall, we had over 15,000 flowers per day in these lots. You can see the pictures of the red sage and turchcaps over here. So we had a lot of flowers to attract birds to linger, migrate through, stop for a few days. We had plenty of food and we had cover. But the wintertime is what you need something, for those birds to make it through the winter. So what does it look like in the wintertime? That's it. Most of those plants are deciduous. This happens to be a yaupon that's snuck through for a few years, and eventually I got rid of it. But this is what they prospered in. They spent the winter in this thick brush that dominant hummers could not get to them. You get sunlight through there, even on a cold day. It's warm. You've sat in sunlight in a cold day, get out of the wind on a porch. It can be fairly comfortably warm. You may not even need a coat. Well, that's the same with hummers. The insects start stirring. They have insects to eat, and they have sugar water. If they just had sugar water, they may not make it through the winter. They do need insects, and this setting produced that. This is the middle trail separating the two lots that Craig Zelk eventually bought. Go back to here. So we moved into the brush. And like I mentioned, we increased the number of feeders. And eventually when Craig bought the second lot, We added a few more feeders, but that was only so much I could do. I went down the hill to change sugar water twice a week. And about half the time, or half the feeders, they didn't need anything. You could leave them for the next round. But half of them needed to be emptied, cleaned out with fresh water, then have new sugar water put in on each trip for managing the feeders. So that was roughly 40 feeders that I had to change out every time I made these service trips. Just look at some of the numbers. It got real impressive. So this isn't birds that spent the entire winter there. They were caught during that 1st of November to the 28th of February. I'll show you some numbers later. I got a board that shows all the bands that were used during that particular year when we had 160 birds. But during this period of November through February, well, I had 56 different buff bellies. Of that, 30 were caught in prior years. But as the winter moved on, I don't know if I ever had more than 40 that I could document at any one time. That's a lot of buff bellies, particularly when it was more than they had anything in the valley. Let's think about that. The valley birds didn't stay for the winter in any large numbers. They have a few, but not like what I've seen in my yard. And the birds from my yard over time, I did get maybe 3 or 4 foreign recaptures of the buff belly from my yard. And they were all up the coast. Why? It wasn't that my birds didn't go south. There were no hummingbird banders south of Victoria. So it's pretty hard to get a band return unless you have somebody actively catching them. The only way you'd get a band return is if somebody found one dead, because we had no banders down there. And we had good numbers of rufous, so 28 average per winter. Black chins, 26. Ruby throats, 10. But look at the ruby throats, notice none from prior years. Our thoughts were either the ruby throats left or they died. They don't seem to be as hardy. We just don't know what happened to them, but most of the ruby throats were caught like the first week of banding. Now, during migration, I tried to band 3 times a week. But in the winter study, it would be pretty hard on the birds if I tried to catch them 3 times a week. So what we did is we spaced out the banding to accommodate the birds, trying to catch almost all the birds that passed through the yard during that period, which is not many. And so what we did was we banded at 2-week intervals. So starting closest convenient date to November 1st, we'd start banding at 2-week intervals, and we'd run it through February. We found quite a bit of movement in November. You had new birds coming in. You had birds that had been molting for maybe 2 months, decided to leave. And so that went on. December, there was still some incoming birds. January, it was like it said, if you're here, stay. There was very little movement. As soon as February rolled around, birds start moving in and out again. So the rufuses were departing, new buff bellies were coming in. We had some movement going on. And typically with the buff belly in Victoria, it was a one-time nester for the season. We know black chin hummingbirds near San Antonio are ruby-throated in East Texas. They sometimes can nest twice in a season. But the traditional buff-bellied in the valley, they nested in 2 time periods during the breeding season. Their first time was in February or early March. They would nest with young coming out in May. Then they nest again in June, July, I think around June, and then their young would come out in July. So when we first started studying these buff bellies, we'd first see young of the year buff bellies in late June, early July. So we were thinking, okay, these birds are synced with this Turk's cap. They didn't leave the yard until around May 15th. They went to a suitable area for territory or raise young. From May 15th to the time the young hatch is 20 something days, then another 20 days or so for the young to be flying. And there you go, July, you got little fluffy buff bellies flying around. But amazingly, I was banding sometime in the early 2000s, and I caught a buff belly and it puzzled me. I was in something like, it's either April or early May. This bird looks funny. I was looking at, oh my God, the whole bill was black. If you look at the that picture I had earlier, that was an adult male buff-bellied hummingbird. It has a red over 80% of the bill on the top with just a little black tip. The female has maybe 25 to 30% of the bill being black and the rest is red on the top. This buff bellied I had in the hand had a lot of buffy edging on the feathers, and it had a totally black bill on the top. It was a young of the year in April. So the birds eventually started nesting like they do in the valley in the early 2000s. And so you start getting 2 nesting attempts per year by some birds, or at least 2 time periods where you saw evidence of young being produced. So that was pretty exciting to me. Looking through your, one thing for those of you that suffer my editing on Christmas bird counts, now your compiler is told I need documentation if that hummingbird is a female. I know you can identify a male rufous. It has rufous on the back. It has some kind of a gorget. But the female looks an awful lot like an Allen's. So we were averaging 28 rufous per winter and 7 Allen's per winter. That means about 20% of those Selasphorus were Allen's. That ratio might be appropriate for San Antonio. But everybody tries to report their birds as rufous. You really need to document how you identified it as a rufous or a black chin or a ruby throat, because it is challenging. We have some experts out there that can identify them at a feeder fairly accurately as far as the black chin and ruby throat, but most people cannot. And you need to be aware you can have Allen's in your area, and you need to document why you made a decision for species.
Dr. Ortego, we've got
Yes.
some questions that are related to what you've been talking about here.
Okay.
If you would like to address them now. It says, did you ever find the buff-bellied nest? It says, I've heard they use palm leaves in the valley. Did you ever find any of their nest?
No, that must be why I didn't have one. We didn't have any palm trees in the yard. I have not. I've looked, but it's a challenge to find a black chin. I'll give you an example. Hummer House, Dan Brown in San Angelo. He has an estimated 4,000 hummingbirds nesting near his house. How many hummingbirds does he find in a nest he finds in a given year? Might be a dozen. They're really hard to locate. There are some that you can find that are positioned over water. Some reports say hummingbirds like to nest over water. And yes, I've found several nests of black chins over water. But they're bound to nest somewhere else because you go to a property that has thousands of birds. And, how far are they going to fly, to feed at a hummingbird feeder and then fly back to feed their young? Say a quarter mile. I don't know how far they'd fly, but I wouldn't anticipate much more than a quarter of a mile. So what is the density of these birds when you start to do a radius of a quarter mile? It's multiple birds per acre, and it's challenging to locate them. You have to really know what the nest site looks like and the nest, but I have not found it. Next question.
The question is, are male and female winter mortalities the same?
I don't know. The band returns is very similar. That's kind of an indication that survivorship's about the same. I don't know if I look very closely at the differences between the male and female in that situation, but it was not strikingly different.
Okay, thank you.
Is that it, Patsy?
There right now, there's some general questions, but we can wait till the end.
Okay. So let's move on. Tell you one more little story. Calliope. We had a pretty small sample size. And we always thought, I'm a proponent of putting feeders in places that protect some of the more timid hummingbirds. So if you're trying to beef up the number of hummingbirds in your yard, I generally don't like to cluster them except when you got these archolocusts migrating through. But if they're spending the summer or they're spending the winter, I try to spread them out a little more. So you look at the size of the calliope versus the buff-bellied or aggressive rufous, they're a pretty small bird. So we always tended to put a few feeders more into the bushes than in the middle of a trail where it was pretty conspicuous. And anyway, with the calliope, we're not getting any band returns after a year. But we got a call one day. There was somebody in Houston said they had a calliope in their yard with a band on it. Oh, so Craig Zalk and Samita were from Houston, so we sicked them on that site. And they caught the bird, and it was a bird that wintered in our property. I said, oh, okay, it's on the way to our house. No. I think it got tired of being beaten up over there and said one winter was enough. So that particular bird moved over to Houston. I don't know if it stayed a second winter in Houston, but I do know he didn't come back to my place. But, just, letting you know that sometime you have to make some little adjustments to attract multiple species. We were regularly getting 8 species of hummingbirds per winter. So that's a fairly good diversity, and there's a lot of competition goes on for species that don't normally coexist.
What's the 8 species? There were 7 listed there. What was the 8th one?
Let me see. Anna's. Anna's the big tough bird. It's probably as big as a buff-bellied. But I've had bad luck with Anna's. I envy people like Petra Hockey in Port O'Connor that almost annually she will get a darn Anna's over there. And me, I've had a few, but not enough to really learn anything from it other than they didn't hang around my house. And we eventually had a 9th species on that year, that the 160th hummingbird was on the last day, I guess in February when we were banding for that winter, and we caught a broadbill. That was pretty exciting. Okay, what does 75 feeders look like? This isn't 75, it's a little less, but it roughly looks like this. Since my house was on a hill and most of the habitat and the feeders were down a hill, we go back to what I told you earlier about 6 degrees or 10-degree differences depending on the night and the humidity. So when it regularly gets around 32 degrees in Victoria, you may have 10 or 12 nights when a typical winter where you're going to have temperatures hovering around freezing. Well, down the hill, it freezes sugar water. Sugar water freezes at 28 degrees. So if you're at 32 on top of the hill, you go 6 degrees less, it's 26. So that's in the zone where the feeders will freeze. So you have to find a way of thawing out the feeders. So initially, I just got up early, went out, got all the feeders because they weren't going to drip in the house. They were frozen. So you just brought them all in the garage, set them up on a table, put a couple of heaters, space heaters underneath, and just crank those things up. By 6:30, when the birds were starting to get active, these were all thawed out. And you ever seen stories in Asia carrying things on a pole? This is sort of how I did it. You could use a mop handle, stick it through about 10 feeders, lift it up and take off. Put those out, come back, grab another 10. In 6-7 trips, you had all these feeders deployed, and birds didn't know any difference come daybreak. Later on, I decided to do it a little differently. I got tired of waking up before 4 o'clock to go service feeders. I just wait till it got dark, then I go take in the feeders. The birds aren't going to the feeders in the night, so you just wait till it got dark. The birds are probably already in torpor. So 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, something like that. Just take them in, set them in your garage, and they never froze. So come daybreak, you could sleep in a little later and take the feeders out. It seems.
Sorry, there was a question. How much food did you put in the feeders to start with? And
some people think you got to fill the feeder. You have to put enough sugar water to last till the next time you're going to service the feeder. So in my situation, this is an 8-ounce feeder. It's produced in Poteet, Texas. It's inexpensive. The reason I used it because it wasn't the most attractive feeder, but it was very durable, easy to clean, very durable. And I did something else. I don't know if you know what this is. This is a collar made of PVC that I made to fit between the glass jar and the base of the feeder. Why? Even in the winter, we have bees. So the bees are a serious problem as far as competing with the hummingbirds, sucking off all your sugar water. So I put these collars, I cut them to fit, and you put these collars on the feeders, and that generally took care of the bee problem. But getting back to how much sugar water, I put enough sugar water so I could see the water level when I made an inspection 3 days later. If I didn't see any sugar water above the collar here, I would open it up and see how much fluid was still left and make some kind of determination of whether or not, leave the feeder or go ahead and clean it. So this is an 8-ounce jar. I'm guessing somewhere around 2 ounces to 3 ounces. There were times when the bees weren't too bad. I'd use those little test tube type feeders, and they work fine in the winter, but they challenging to keep the bees off.
Well, that was a question. It says, could you explain the bee collars a bit more? So I'm a beekeeper and try to keep them separate.
Well, the bee collar is just the primary access a bee has to hummingbird feeder is the threads of the neck right here. So if you can exclude the bee from these threads, it can get sugar water. Now, if you happen to clean your feeders in a dishwasher, you might overheat the plastic to where you warp it. And if you warp that plastic, you can have it being uneven between the base and the lid right here. And you can have some bee access just walking underneath the rings. So those are things to kind of watch for. Don't use a dishwasher to clean the plastic. You can do the jars, it's not a problem. But if you do put the feeders in the dishwasher, make sure it's not super hot, have them on the high rack. Things you can do also with bees, whether you're in the winter or you at some other time of the year. Bees prefer the highest concentration of sugar. So you can discourage some bee activity by reducing the sugar content of your water. Hummingbirds don't need the 20% sugar. That's just the standard rate we set across the nation. 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. Okay, that's the standard rate. But you can have it 10%, and you're still going to get hummingbirds using it. But your bees may like daisies or other flowers in preference to having a low sugar water in a feeder. Another thing that affects the sugar water taste to a bee, they like a hot toddy. So if you put your feeder in the sun, you're more prone to get some bee activity than you have it in the shade. So keep those things in mind. Put them in the shade, maybe reduce the concentration a little bit. And if you're a little desperate, you can put a really high concentration of sugar with the water to where it maybe doesn't even dissolve, and put it in the sun and in a tray and leave it there for the bees. The bees will figure it out and they'll go to that tray of sugar versus going to that diluted solution for the hummingbirds. Did that answer the question?
Good tips. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, I think I've went through all these numbers before. Okay. But it's kind of interesting looking at how many returnees you get on average every year. So the Rufuses, fairly consistently around 20%, somewhere in that ballpark. Black chins, similar numbers. We're going to get into some percentages a little later. This is what my banding site looked like. Here's all this dense brush. Notice all the trails? Well, I went in with a push lawnmower initially and just busted some paths through the greenbriers and through the dewberries and whatever was growing out there. And we made trails roughly every 10 yards, I think it was. Our feeders were spaced at 5-yard intervals. And these tags are for mist net locations. The feeders were probably they were twice as abundant. No, I'm wrong. There was 1 feeder per net. So they were spaced at 5-yard intervals. So 15 feet and the nets were very similar in length. But you can see just in a grid fashion, we had a high concentration of feeders. We tried to use visibility barriers to make some of the birds compatible closer together. But if you stack 100 hummingbirds in this, this is about 4 acres right here. They're pretty close together. But if they have enough cover, they can avoid the dominance. But it's really tough birds. So I took the banding data a little further. I was curious. It says, why not break it down and see if there's any habitat preferences? Now looking at this is the percent availability of the different habitats: willow, live oak, mesquite, and brush. And this is the percent of capture of those particular species. And I circled in red for those that had what looked like a sizable less percentage than availability, and green where there seemed to be a preference where they were using it much more than what was available. The buff-bellied, which was the biggest hummer on the place, he got to choose. He roughly had the same percentage of capture as the percentage of that habitat was available. So he just went and got pretty much whatever he wanted. And they probably spaced themselves out more than the others made them space out. So roughly, there's a little bit of differences right here, but I don't think it was that big of a difference, 10% with the sample size we're dealing with. Now the rufous, notes have 2 reds. So you got into the live oak, where it's more of a park-like setting. Rufuses, 13% were caught in that setting, but 24% was made up by the live oaks. You got into the mesquite, it was denser, but for whatever reason, maybe the branches weren't as thick, but we only caught 8% of the rufuses in a mesquite type setting, and out of 16% of the habitat. But 72% of the rufuses were caught in a brush setting. They liked fairly dense brush bordering the trail with open lanes where the trail was. And, half of the property was in brush, but we caught 72% of the rufuses in that setting. Black chin's a little different. They seem to have a preference for the mesquite, twice as high capture rate and availability, where the reverse was true for dense brush. Was it because the rufous was over there in high numbers that the black chins couldn't make inroads? That's a possibility. So when you're trying to figure all this out, you got to take into account the availability of the habitat, but somewhere in there you have to factor is what's the dominance of that species, and that may affect habitat use as much as the habitat itself. But anyway, this is what the numbers showed on that project. Allens were kind of like the rufous. They were more prone to be in a brush setting than they were to be in tree type settings, more open landscape. Okay. And here's the board on that. Every year when we were banding, we kept track of the hummers as they were banded, recaptured particularly, because we've gone through there. We wanted to know if this bird was caught before during that season. So you just quickly look at the board and say, okay, this is a new for the season, just add the number. So you go in here, and if you can squint and see it, I'm not sure how large this appears on your computer, all these different letters. Okay, these different letters represent a batch of hummingbird bands issued by the Bird Banding Lab. And it might have been something like 100,000 bands or some number like that for each letter. So as we went through in time, like the first band we started using was a Y series. Then afterwards, we started getting these other different letters. And so you're looking at that, you can see what it should indicate is in that pool of birds, there's some different ages. So here's a bird that's a Y that started off with the first bans that were issued for this property. And he was recaught during the 15th year of this research project. Well, not actually the 15th, it was probably the 12th year. This is when we had one in the 60th. So this bird ended up being 11 years old. This is a buff-bellied. I caught it fairly early on in the project, and I caught it every year after that for like 10 years in a row. I was kind of fond of that bird, and one day it just stopped showing up. But anyway, these kind of give you an idea of the ages of the bird just based on the letter. Here's some Y series here. On this, well, that's buff bellies. So what the numbers represent in the circle, the number on the right is how many of that species we caught during the period of 1st of November through February. The number in the front represents the number that we caught more than once. We're just trying to get an idea of had we caught that bird earlier during the year, and if it did, we changed the color. I think the blue represents a bird that was caught more than once during the year, during the winter. So we're just giving us kind of a snapshot of the different age groups we had going through there and how many different birds we had. And it was interesting, but each one of these bands is like a social security number, and it kind of tells a story. And Patsy, you want me to tell you that story about Lafayette?
Sure.
Okay. You know, one of your thrills, banding in this setting is not very efficient if you don't have somebody on the distribution of your study bird that can recapture the bird. So if it's just depending on the bird coming back to your banding station, how much can you learn? It's less than if you had a lot of banders out there and they could capture your bird. You could detect some movements. We had a lady, Hannah Richards, that did quite a bit of banding in the hill country. And her project was she loved banding hummingbirds. And every day she would band up to a certain level, then she'd quit because she was tired and they'd go back home. But you could look at her study, it was like a wagon wheel, because she'd go from her home a certain distance and she had a cooperator where she'd band. So she had like 8 or 10 different sites. But the neat thing of her study was they're all in close proximity, and she banded them frequent enough she could recapture her own birds that moved between sites. So looking at her data with black-chin, it was shown that the males had a higher tendency to move between sites than a female. A female will, hypothetically, if she produced a young, maybe she'd stay there and suck, next year. Where the male, he was just looking for action, and it gets a little slow around July 1st. They may go somewhere else. But Hannah, they traveled all over that hub, and they got enough data where you could start looking at things of that sort, recaptures by different sexes. Now, getting back to Lafayette and the buff belly, I mentioned that we don't have any banders south, so we don't know what the birds are doing when they leave the house unless somebody recaptures it. So I've had maybe 5 of the buff bellied I banded that were caught by somebody else. Nancy Newfield caught a couple. There's a guy in Alabama caught one. There's a guy in Lafayette caught one, and maybe one other person. But the one in Lafayette was real interesting in that I was just doing my banding thing, and we band however many we could in fall and winter, and we got a report over the internet that he caught one of my banded birds. the bands are registered, so when they catch your bird within that day, they can figure out who banded it and when. So I got a call from them, and actually I knew the guy because I was from Louisiana, and we birded together a little bit. So this buff-bellied went to his mother's house. He banded it and watched it. The darn bird stayed there all winter. I just emailed him and said, "Hey, let me know when your bird leaves. I'll see if he comes back to my house." So he notified me in the spring when the bird left, and 2 weeks later I caught it. That's pretty exciting. So I had banded it the previous fall. It left. He caught it in Lafayette, spent the winter over there, left his mother's house, and I caught it 2 weeks later. That was pretty exciting. Then, but the bird didn't stay. So I recaptured that spring, but he left sometime, probably around May 15th, is when all the other buff bellies left. But came August or September, I recaptured that bird, and I probably caught it multiple times during the fall until it finished its molt. And then I get a note from him sometime during the fall that says, "Hey, Brent, it's back. When's the last time you saw it?" I looked at my data sheet and I said, "Oh, about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago." So we were documenting how long it took this bird to travel to that distance. And we start looking at it to try to determine these birds coming back, not just with the buff belly, with other species. We kind of look at the returns and says, okay, do they do it quicker with time? They know the route a little better. They get there quicker. In general, that's true. The more often that bird is going between a banding site, say two banding sites, two capture sites, in time they seem to be going quicker. It's not absolute, but I've looked at some data for different species that I catch and recapture, and it seemed like they get here a little earlier every winter, that sort of thing. But anyway, so the bird came back in the fall, and then it went, and he caught it again for the second winter. It stayed there, came back, I caught it again. Well, we were developing this relationship, but it ended with that last third capture by me for that bird, third season. But that was pretty cool. I want to give you some data. So what this says on the top row, which is this row over here, percent recapture after 1 week. So I'm trying to catch birds 3 times a week. But I looked at the data for birds that lingered at least 1 week. And the bottom row is recapture after 1 year. So here's the data from the ruby throats. Whether you catch it in the spring or fall, generally about 8% of them will stay about a week. That's it at my banding site. Right on the coast, they may go through faster. If birds are known, if they get caught in a migration movement where you just have thousands of birds passing through, they're likely to follow. They're responding to the same stimulus. Like we had earlier this week, we had 2 days of north winds. Well, that stimulus was slow down. You're fighting the wind. It's going to require more energy. But as soon as the wind turns to the south, I guarantee you, I go back to Riverside Park, I'm not going to get 17 species of warblers tomorrow because the wind's out of the south right now, and they're going to take advantage of that, and they're going to leave. The same thing with the hummers. But recapturing the ruby throat after 1 year, like at my site, I caught a few, but it was less than 0.1%. About 1 out of every 1,000 I'd end up recapturing. So the likelihood is pretty low on ruby throats. Black chins, we have a little different situation on black chins. There is a coastal breeding population of black chins, but they don't breed at my house. but they breed fairly close by. And black chins regular over winter. Ruby throats, until recently, they did not regularly overwinter. Now I'm seeing ruby throats that I'm pretty sure stay the winter, or at least stay most of the winter before they happen to disappear. But what's kind of interesting with the black chins, I had a simultaneous project in the hill country. I was banding once a month for 8 years at Lakey, at the Birded Ranch, and at Comfort at Sue Wiedenfels, and I forgot the third site. It was also in Comfort. No, I just forgot. But anyway, so that opened up the door that maybe some of the birds we banded in the hill country would migrate to the Texas coast and maybe spend the winter. And we caught a few. But anyway,
Brent, we have some folks that are going to have to log off about 8. If you could,
I'll speed it up. I'm almost at the end.
okay, because
Anyway,
we want to hear it.
These are the numbers. March through September, the birds, I was just looking at those 2 time periods because most people take down their feeders at the end of October. I want to let you know that you need to leave them longer, and the birds are not going to stick. They're not likely to stick and stay with you until you get into October or later for the winter. But birds caught in the March through September, I recapture about 14% of those. Where those in October to February, black chins, 50%. So half of them, if they arrive in October, we're going to be there during the wintertime. And this is their percent return the following year, 4% for those that were in that March-September period. They didn't really have a reason to stay. They didn't have a reason to come back to it. So they left. They're only there for a few days, and they left in this period. And it shows that they didn't have much of a site fidelity, probably because they didn't stay there long. These birds stayed the winter, so 23% were caught in the following year. Buff bellies. It didn't seem to matter when you caught the bird during the season. It was about the same percentage whether you caught them in that March to September or October to February. But 1 year after, about 22% to 24% you'd catch the following year or years. Rufous. I've had some people tell me they've had one Rufous hummingbird for 10 years. Maybe, but that's a long time for a hummingbird. But I had a problem with Rufuses and Allens early on when I was banding. I chased down every one I could catch. But what I find out, if I caught them during this period, they tended not to winter. And the people would look at you really stern. But what did you do to my hummingbird? It left after you banded it. So I start questioning myself, did I really cause the bird to move, or was there something else going on? The bird hadn't really established during this period their winter territory. So only 15% I could recapture, a week or so later. But you get into October, February, over half of those I could recapture during the winter. And if you look at the following year, I was catching about 18% of those, and none of those that were in March through September. So again, they didn't stay there long enough to develop some site fidelity. So when they left, that was it. They were going somewhere else. And similar numbers for the Allens. Seemed like I could recapture them fairly readily in March through September, but following winter or year, no, 0. But if I caught the bird in October, there's high probability I would recapture it again during that winter. And 22% is not a bad recapture rate for a year following. It's similar numbers. It looks like the broadtail is a bird that arrives later in the winter and leaves pretty early, like February. So you're not going to really capture it in March through September. and it's going to show up in November to February, for the winter time. So, but you'd recapture most of them if you caught them initially, and you'd have a fair percentage, 60% you could catch the following year. Calliope, pretty small sample size, but if when they did show up in the wintertime, they tended to stay, but very low recovery rate. Folks, that's it. I enjoyed giving you a presentation. I'm available for a few more questions if you have time.
Okie dokie. Thank you. That the numbers don't lie, do they? There are a couple of questions in general that I would like you to. I'm going up here quickly. There was some. I had a question about the 25% difference in size for the male and female. Does that true across the other species that you worked with, or just one of the species?
In general, the female is a bigger bird. Now, with the buff-bellied, I'm not sure if the female is bigger than the male, but definitely in the Archilochus and in the Slasherus, the females are bigger.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Is red sage the same as tropical sage? This was a question. When you talk about red sage, is that?
To some people, it is. You know how common names are used. Yeah, red sage in some places it's called tropical sage.
And the other question was shrimp plants and Turk's cap are essential. What other plants, now of course we're in a little bit different area, what other plants would be helpful if you want your hummingbirds to be wintering?
I would start off with having your best flowering plants in the fall. If you want them to winter, you want them to maybe molt while they're on your property. So if you have a high food source, you would think that would maybe influence their decision to stay. So whatever plants work best for your area, there's a lot of exotic plants out there that can, with a little heat lamps or warm alcoves, you can get them to be flowering through the winter or at least late into the fall. And just try as many flowers as you can. I used a fairly good variety, and I tried to get plants of different sizes just so you could stagger them. You could expose, 3 or 4 different species of flowers in the same space, more or less. You could have a low growing herb. You could have a medium height shrub. You could have vines going up a tree. Those things work.
Layering is good.
Layering.
And we had a comment here. It says your experience reinforces the wisdom of not cutting back plants in the winter too soon, leaving them in place as cover and protection for the birds. Just you're at the end of February, you cut them and that kind of thing. Okay, let me just see. Got the bee collars, very interesting on decreasing the amount of sugar. And I think that is it. Although somebody was astounded that there was an 11-year-old hummingbird.
Yeah, the buff belly, the longest I had was 11 years. The black chin, the longest I've had was 9 years. The Rufus, I think 6 years was the longest I was able to recapture a bird, but there are other people that seem like 9 years is about the end, right in that ballpark.
Well, here's one kind of like two questions. I'm curious how many feeders you keep out these days, and if you keep out more in the winter or in the summer, and do you still band hummingbirds? Those are our last questions.
Okay, I stopped banding in 2010. I was working under Ross Dawkins, and he finished up all he was going to do with hummingbirds at that time, and that was fine with me. And I had other banding of songbirds to do following that. And what was the other part?
Let's say, it says, how many feeders do you keep out now? And
most of the time in the winter, I keep out a dozen. Now,
A
interesting
dozen?
thing, right? Interesting thing with the when I quit banding. So I was running 75 feeders, and I was getting upwards of 100 hummingbirds to spend the winter. So what happened the year I quit banding, and I reduced the number of feeders? So the first winter after finished banding, I maintained 25 feeders. And the most hummingbirds we were able to document was during the Christmas bird count. And I think I ended up with about 20 hummingbirds. So when I went from that 75 feeders down to 25, I had all these birds returning from previous years because I had proof that a certain percentage was going to return, like 20% was going to come back. But if they came back, they didn't stay. Because by the time the Christmas bird count rolled around and I had my 25 feeders spread out, I could only locate 20 birds. And then gradually I phased out. It's a good bit of work to have 25 feeders down to about a dozen, close to the house. I got lazy. I didn't want to go up and down that hill as much. And
I can
so
see that.
I'll always leave at least one feeder down the hill for those, just to give a bird a chance to get away from the crowd. Because if you stake out 11 feeders around the house, that's about as much as you can place without some too much competition. But that means that bird doesn't just stay right at the feeder. He has to duck back into the habitat for a period of time, then come to the feeder that he's defending and access it, then go back and forth. And so it's a little more challenging, but I don't need to have that many unless it's just try to prove a point.
Would you put up your last slide again, just so it can be on the recording for longer? That last one that kind of had the summary.
This,
There. Yeah,
okay,
there we go.
what
Yeah.
does all of this mean? Excuse me, I didn't read it out. This is Colorado, but anyway.
Yeah.
Numbers that survive the winter will likely return next winter. I've shown that with data, about 20%. Winter hummer density is directly related to the number of feeders, flowers available. So food availability can affect birds being there. If hummers have adequate cover, shrubs, vines, whatever it takes, if the climate is mild, say as near Raisin, we have a Gulf Coast.
If we don't have a snowmageddon again.
Right. Well, all of my birds survived that severe freeze 2 winters ago. I had about 8 Rufuses in the yard, and there were 8 after the freeze. They made it. I've heard other people that they didn't. So I don't know what they were. They may have had issues keeping them thawed. So one thing, briefly, because the sugar water freezes in the glass doesn't mean that all the sugar water is actually frozen. It seemed like the plastic base takes longer to freeze than up top, but you do have to maintain it so the bird is not sucking on a lollipop.
Mm-hmm.
And if you fail to do that, you'll probably lose your bird. I don't know if that's what happened with the people losing hummingbirds or what, but it was a tough time for birds as well as people.
Well, I think we can all say without reservation that we know a lot more about hummingbirds now than we did when we started. And it just shows how much work and how much dedication it takes to learn these kind of things. And we have a couple of people who are interested in maybe contacting you personally to ask you maybe about how they can become involved in this kind of work. Would you be open to sharing, if I can share your contact with them?
Sure.
Right. Well, thank you. This was awesome. And thank you for sharing all that work and all the time and all the feeders and all the sugar water and all of the birds. Really appreciate your coming. And we thank everybody who came tonight. And we will post the video, the recording of this video tomorrow after it gets converted and posted on the Vimeo channel. You can go on the website and the meeting section. We have a section that says, in case you missed it. Or if you want to go back over certain areas of that, you can run it forward or backwards and so forth. So I would wish everybody a good evening, and keep in mind those hummingbirds, a lot of them are staying around the winter, so provide for them. They deserve it. And thank you so much again, Dr. Ortego, for taking your time and spending it with us. So everybody, thanks a lot. And if you have any other questions, you can send them to us, and we'll send them on to Brent, and if he has time, he can answer them later. So we'll say good night and happy hummingbirds. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.